the time that we are in right now. There has been a general consensus that higher education needs to be much more effective as engines of social transformation and economic success. And that requires a redesign of existing models and potentially the building of new models to really get to that place of social transformation and economic success. Of course, that implies funding, and it implies funding for everything from physical infrastructure to technology infrastructure, development of faculty, investments in research, and investments in preparing students for longer-term careers. So there has always been a sense that higher education needed more support. And then along came the pandemic that really exposed in a very stark way huge gaps in the existing designs in higher education and significant opportunities. It revealed to us that global higher education was not adequately prepared to meet the needs of our learners. And so we are in a different space now, talking with an increased sense of urgency about the investments needed in higher education to really serve our societies and to prepare the next generation of our students for jobs and careers and to become lifelong learners. So we have a fantastic panel of experts to help us unpack the opportunities and challenges in higher education. I'm going to introduce them very briefly so we can use the time here for a conversation. Our first panelist is Albert Nsengiyumva. Albert is the Executive Secretary of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa. He has, in a previous career, also been the Minister for Infrastructure and the Minister for Technical and Vocational Skill Development in Rwanda. We have with us Remy Rieu, CEO of AFD, the French Development Agency, and the chairman of the International Development Finance Club. Joining us is also Stavros Yanuka, CEO of WISE, the World Innovation Summit for Education. And then last but not the least, Geoffroy Girard, Managing Director of the IE Foundation and Director of Reinventing Higher Education Conference of the IE University as well. So warm welcome to our panelists. Before I turn it over to Albert to kick us off, a quick set of comments about the run of the show. We are recording this session. We want to make sure that these ideas and this conversation is available much more broadly beyond this live moment. We've had significant interest from people who were unable to make it at this time. And so we want this conversation to be the first of many that we will have in this particular space. Each of our panelists will speak for about 3 to 4 minutes, offering opening remarks, and then we will open it up to a discussion with our participants. Please use the chat feature to share your thoughts and your comments and your questions as well. Gail and I, as moderators, will pick up your questions from the chat and make sure that they get addressed to the extent possible that we can, make sure that they are presented to our speakers. So without much ado, I'd like to open it up to our panel and we'll invite Albert to kick us off.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Mino. Let me express my gratitude to have been for the invitation to attend this important webinar. My take on this, first of all, let me just share with you a couple of things that we learned even before the COVID-19. My organization initiated a mapping exercise within the African continent to try and understand where higher education stands vis-a-vis major strategic directions that the continent has taken, for the last couple of years. And in summary, what I actually came up with was the first and most critical one, a mismatch between demand and supply. We could see that most of our educations have been teaching and actually allowing learning without integrating a number of aspects that are so critical, including the use of technology, for example, the challenge of climate change, and others. But at the same time, the interaction between the private and learning institutions is still at a very low stage. It needs, indeed, need to be expanded. So that's really a serious issue that we came up with. And that mismatch has a number of reasons, because when you look at the historical background of higher education in Africa, it has mainly been built to actually supply civil servant to governments, as opposed to addressing the needs both at the social and economic level. A few countries, including entrepreneurs, are coming up with new models to support the redesign of higher education in Africa, particularly trying to turn the knowledge aspect into skills, because the industry needs more skills. And this is so important, particularly in higher education. And we have seen the emergence of new practices, including new approaches of learning and teaching. And this is where technology has become so critical. We have also noticed the integration of entrepreneurship skills, which is so critical as well. But more importantly, and this is a common issue, as let me call it a dilemma in most of countries, is how a country can be able to address at the same time the issue of accessibility to higher education, in the same time raise quality of teaching and learning and the relevance of the delivery of the offering. So having those three combined are really challenging to many countries. And as you know, higher education in particular, public, has always been funded by government, with limitations, of course. We have seen a call to bring in the private sector. But when you talk about the private sector in many of our countries, we're talking about informal sector. While investing in higher education requires a long-term investment with a clear understanding on how to get return. And this is where I see the issue of sustainability lies. So it is really so critical that by rethinking the redesign of a university, we place the higher education at a core center of social and economic development. And there's a great opportunities. Let me share a few of them. Number one, as I said, we are living in the era known as the fourth industrial revolutions. Even though Africa is still lagging behind, there are some good examples that are coming up, where we see young people taking lead in creating new enterprises, in engaging in the use of technology. Mobile money is one example of this kind. And we have seen drones. We are seeing more and more new innovation happening. The question is, how do we create that opportunity of interaction between higher education and those young entrepreneurs, where government can come and facilitate that engagement as well? Now, the last thing is, of course, to revisit the offering, particularly expecting a student to wait for 4 years before he enters the labor market is too long. Why don't we integrate some modular system, competency-based system? I think that's really the way to go. And there's still a room for improvement, but I believe if everyone is willing to partner, the financing can only be achieved once higher education become demand-driven, addressing the needs of the industry, so that industry can feel there's a potential return they can get once they invest. So let me stop by here to allow others to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Really appreciate your comments there. I will turn it over to Remy now for his opening remarks.
Thanks a lot, Minou, and thanks for the invitation. I see Gael. I know what the Learning Planet Institute is doing right now. Third edition of this festival. Congratulations, and very happy to share the floor with distinguished colleagues. more expert than I am actually on this very issue, and especially Albert opening the floor. I'm here more to represent what international financial institutions are thinking about it, and confront it with your experience. And I think this debate is particularly helpful at the heart of the COVID-19 crisis, where we all measured, yes, this mismatch Albert was referring to. I would say both. We measured the urgency of the crisis. Of course, it undermined progress in higher education and research. The sector has been hit very hard. On top of what we already knew about the challenges, we know, for instance, that in Africa there are about 14 million students, but projections indicate that the number will double by 2030, and Africa being a proxy of a more global issue. And we all measured during the crisis that human capital has to be considered differently. It's very clear now for health. It's the most precious resource worldwide. A doctor, a nurse, or whatever, we're all ready to pay for it, whatever the price. And we have to train more specialists in the health sector. It's true also more broadly for the education sector. And so certainly we have to see it less as a spending and more as an investment, and innovate in the way to finance the sector. In this perspective, of course, we have to develop a holistic view of education. So traditional donors certainly have to change their approach and see the system, meaning primary, secondary, and higher education, and not as successive stages, but as a whole. Of course, the most obvious challenge is the training of the teachers themselves. We know that children are, especially in Africa, even in poor countries, now children are at school, which is good news. But the question is the quality of education now that is too low, and where the higher education component needs to be strengthened, and in this regard. So we have to finance higher education also. But of course, and that's my second point, we have to do it in an innovative way. We know the share of education within ODA. So ODA is slightly increasing year after year, but it's still way too small. And the share of ODA for education is less than 10%. I think it's 7%. And higher education in this share is extremely low. And the challenges, I mean, the World Bank has estimated that the funding gap for only the digital transformation of universities in Africa amounts to 52 billion total. So we're far from it, and we have to develop financing tools that goes way beyond ODA. This is something that is progressively happening. So there are pilots we will, well, I think tomorrow we have a very nice project that will be approved, hopefully, by the AFD board in Nigeria. It's called the iDice program for about $700 million with an investment fund within. And we will invest $100 million in it to push for a private supply of education, of course. You know what is happening in Côte d'Ivoire for energy transition. You know the ACE program, more on the research side with the World Bank, that proved so helpful for COVID, for research on COVID in Africa. So we have to unlock new ways of financing higher education, and of course there's a lot to share with what is happening in the US or in Europe or elsewhere in the world, creating networks and partnerships between what you are doing here is particularly promising, and you have to insert, and we can help on this, other institutions in the global south, in the networks you are forming in so-called developed countries. It's the case within the programs we are financing, so many institutions involved. And of course, if this financing is coming, it will help leapfrog and push for innovative learning methods, develop territorial approaches for more access. There's a lot happening, of course, on this. Last but not least, I see this happening. Considering only AFD, but we are at the center of so many linkages with other public development banks worldwide. We see something happening and interest in the sector. For the last 5 years, we invested more than 500 million euro as AFD, and good news is that we are doing it through all our instruments. Can be grants, of course, can be sovereign or non-sovereign loans, can be investments, and in each and every region in the world. So, of course, urgency, of course, a deep concern, but also, I think, a sign of hope, and I think a consciousness that the festival will only help grow, that higher education is not a luxury. It's not something to be discarded, and that we have to invest heavily in this. Thanks.
Thank you, Remy, and would love to unpack the innovative models as we get into discussion. But for now, I'd like to turn it to Stavros for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mino, and thank you, Albert and Remy, for your comments. Gael, also my congratulations on this third edition of the Learning Planet. So I was in a previous life a consultant, so you'll forgive me if I think and speak in frameworks. But I promise you it's a very simple framework, and I just want to address the issue by talking a little bit about who pays, what are they paying for, and when and how do they pay. So I think traditionally with higher education, we've tried to answer this question by trying to determine whether higher education is a public versus a private good. And people may disagree for very good reason, but the evidence seems to point to the fact that most of the benefits of higher education have accrued to individuals in terms of higher salaries and a broader range of opportunities. And this, in a sense, points towards private funding as being perhaps a more optimal way of thinking about how to finance higher education. However, if we do go down that path, we know that we run the risk of exacerbating inequalities and deepening the societal divide between degree and non-degree holders that we see has now become, dare I say, a political issue in many countries around the world. And so I think, thinking about, who pays on its own and thinking of it purely in terms of public versus private good isn't really going to get us to the answer. The second part of the framework, which is, okay, what is it exactly that we are paying for or they are paying for? And again, I think I am right in saying that the majority of funding models, whether these are public or private, are paying for inputs. So we're paying, if it's the public sector, we're providing subsidies, based on the number of courses offered or the students served. And it's interesting that, that Albert talked about a mismatch between demand and supply of higher education to really explain the point that I would echo, which is really the private sector, which you would have thought is, ought to be demand driven, isn't really demand driven. It is, again, very much, supply driven, because there's this mismatch between demand and supply in the form of demand far outstripping the available supply of higher education. And therefore, there's been very little pressure on higher education institutions to really think carefully about their offerings and to what extent they are serving a broader good and a broader purpose, to the point where I would argue that in many cases today, higher education is really a status symbol or akin to a luxury good. You have to have it in order to signal that you are ready for the professional managerial class, which is the class that accrues the private benefits. Even in countries, like Singapore, and I have some experience of living and working in Singapore for over a decade, where they think of education as an extension of industrial policy, and again they try to manage the availability of places on courses that are seen as more useful than others. But again, this is very much input focused, meaning what's the available supply, and how do I organize it to absorb as much demand as I possibly can. Now, I think we're seeing, and this is, this brings me to my third question of when and how do they pay, or perhaps more appropriately, when and how should they pay? We're now seeing a gradual shift to outcomes-based funding, and there are two examples I want to offer before ending my remarks, and as a way to maybe tee up the conversation later. At a sort of policy strategic level, we have initiatives like the Education Outcomes Fund that's being championed by Gordon Brown and the private equity entrepreneur Sir Ronald Cohen. And the idea here is you mobilize private sector capital to make large-scale investments in education, and then what governments do, or agencies like AFD, which Remy heads, are essentially asked to underwrite and pay a bond-like return, provided certain pre-agreed outcomes are met. And this might very well be a useful way of thinking about redesign in finance when we come to discuss well, what's the role of higher education for for instance in helping us address the climate crisis. Do we want to, for example, link some of this kind of funding to either solutions or the readiness of graduates to take up jobs in the new green economy that we're all hoping to that we will hope to see emerge. And then you have at the sort of more individual level the innovation of income sharing agreements, which originated with vocational startups, tech-oriented, typically vocational startups like the Holberton schools, which started they were started by a Frenchman, interestingly enough, in San Francisco, and have now gone globally, where the idea here is graduates are prepared for jobs in tech. If they secure a job with an income above a certain threshold, then they agree to pay a share of their income for X number of years, again, up to a certain cap. And this model was also picked up by more established universities in the US, like Purdue, which I believe at the moment is the largest university provider of income sharing agreements. And there is a sort of echo of this in the UK government's student loan scheme, where again, it's a more traditional structure, it's a loan, but again, the students only are obligated to start paying back once they earn a salary above a certain threshold. So, we've seen innovations, in financing models come up. But again, if we're very brutally honest about things, these are only scratching the surface in terms of take up. I mean, the numbers are laughably small still in terms of the money that's actually been mobilized. And I would really love to hear my fellow panelists, once we get to the exchange, what their thoughts are about, why is it that we have these ideas, they're seemingly good ideas, why has the take up been so poor and slow? And I'll end there.
And obviously an extremely important question for us to start unpacking here, Stavros. I'd love to bring in Geoffroy for his opening remarks, and then we will open it up for a discussion.
Well, thank you, Minou, and thanks all, and congratulations on IMPA for the third year's edition. And it's a great opportunity to be here, standing alone, fantastic experts and experts that I've been following for years, and role models in terms of financing. What we can add on our side actually is maybe defining really quickly who we are. When we are a small foundation linked to a higher education private institution based in Madrid in Spain, but with a really international scope, having more than 130 nationalities on campus, and trying to move and trying to do collaborative initiatives with institutions across the board, and maybe in that sense, actually, one of the things that I was thinking from the intervention of Albert, of Remy, and even Stavros, when we were talking about the point of that public-private collaboration needed in order to grow. Actually, when we see in the UNESCO meeting and the call for last November, for the global call for to invest in the future of education, bringing leaders from countries from all around the world, one of the questions was actually raising around the importance, for example, that in the EU recovery plan, only 1% was directly directed towards education, which was pretty impressive if we think that education is probably one of the driver for positive change that actually future generation can have and can actually make an impact, transform society and everything. So if we only have 1% dedicated to that, I think that it's a role of universities to be entrepreneur themselves and a big role to play there. And maybe a bit to the point that Stavros was mentioning at the end of his intervention. Why is it so slow? Because in that sense, if we see that allocation to education, direct allocation to education, might not be the big part, and we were talking also about the ODA and those 7% in education at the beginning of the talk by Remy, I think was. At the end, what higher education needs is to be proactive, to go and seek those partnerships with other sectors and business around, in which actually they can bring a difference through the expertise of their researcher, through the expertise of even their students in their learning process, and connect really to other projects that happen across border in different sectors and which are funded actually also either by public, either by private or collaborative of the two in that sense. No? Another thing that I've been witnessing in the past 12 years with the conference Reinventing Higher Education that we've been pushing through in order to actually grow and bring together presidents of universities across the 5 continents, and also having people, not only higher education institutions, but also other stakeholders, like proper students, like CEOs of companies, like opinion makers in media, etc., is that the need for responsive universities, for universities that actually prepare people able to have that positive change to transform is key in the sector. And their institutions searching for funds, I would say, or searching for long-term funds, as was mentioning Albert in his first remark about the importance for higher education to be long-term basis and not just short-term, which is sometimes in projects with corporates difficult because we're more looking into return over investment, and in that collaboration public-private, it's not always easy from the higher education side to actually be able to convince on the long-term effects and benefits that the business world might have actually by collaborating on an initiative coming from talent empowerment, where we were mentioning actually before the income share agreements in one sense. Those new way to finance are here also, but one of the reflection that I was making, thinking also about this panel, is the importance when we see that individual outcome that Stavros was mentioning in the beginning of his remark about the change that it does in someone when he goes through higher education. The biggest beneficiary not only is the individual, but probably the corporations and the markets in which that individual is going to bring his talent afterwards. No? And I think we need more and more to see also, it always has been a core from higher education institution to see, oh, can we actually make that corporations across the world that actually enroll the talent that comes from universities, that come with that in-person everything, and that integrates companies afterwards. How can we return in somehow to that talent previously through some initiative around scholarship directly driven by hirings in companies or any other format that enables also that talent to grow. I'm sure that there's not one answer to that. It's probably many things, but I think that at the same way that corporations have been implementing incubators in the, I would say, the last 10 years to attract startups to their corporation, to help them grow and actually find the advancement and innovation that they're pushing and integrating them inside their institution. I think it's also time for higher education to incubate those social entrepreneurs in field of education because there are tons of initiatives happening around trying to solve issue, trying to answer the SDG, and especially the SDG number 4 and the quality of education. And how can we actually incubate those startups, those innovators, insights, and actually learn from them and push that forward, no? And maybe to come back to the point that Stavros was making at the end of his intervention, that rigidity of change within higher education, maybe in terms of in the moment in which looking for new creative way to fund itself, maybe goes also aligned with that lack of, I would say, social entrepreneurship mindsets that we should have, or pushing people go out of the boundaries of the protocols that university have been established for 1,000 years in the way to proceed, in their way to operate, and the teaching and research that is linked to it. So thank you. And that would be my points.
Thank you, Geoffroy. I will turn it over to my co-host, Gail, to kick off the discussion component of the session.
Well, thanks very much, Minou, and thank you very much, the four of you, for casting the scene. I think we have a fair understanding, or at least a fair overview of the challenges and the need that are just absolutely amazing, from rigidity to the fact that higher education is not as linked or not really responding to the needs on the ground, and so maybe. I mean, we already have a few questions in the chat that I can relate in two big baskets. And what I suggest is that we divide this conversation in two parts. My understanding is that we have a question about what is it that we need to finance and how we can define what needs to be financed. When it's the redesign part, there is the question of what is it that needs to be financed, and the second part, which is how we get the fund for that. And you covered, the four of you covered a little bit of both of those aspects, and I think they are a very good element already. But if we focus on the first one, I wanted to say that over the last three days, and I'm really sorry that we don't have young people here that can challenge us a little bit more. But if I try to be the young people voice, which of course is difficult because I don't have the age, but what they have been saying is that we fundamentally need a new model. It's not only about getting jobs, it's about getting the right jobs to turn over a lot of industries. It's about changing the institutions. It's about, we need, and it's about changing the way we approach education. It's not only the traditional education of you need to learn the math and the physics, etc. It's also about how do you become a better person, how you create a better collective, how you engineer problem-solving attitudes. So there's a lot of things that are related to the needs of redesigning that corresponds to one of the young people is saying, for a good planet, we need good persons. So and I think that's really deep and profound. And so most of our universities, whether they're so-called developed or so-called undeveloped or developing or whatever, in front of sustainable development, we are all developing countries. So I think we all have to re-engineer a lot of stuff. So in that in mind, in front of the sustainable development goals and in front of the inner development goals for everyone to be able to access the right information to be a better person that can be a better person for its collective and for the planet. How can we, and I don't know anything about the finance industry or the finance mechanism, but how can that be integrated so that whatever the lump of money or it is earmarked for something which will go in the right direction? How can we connect those needs with the money? What needs to be done? Maybe you know already of good examples of how this is integrated, and maybe you have a few words on what needs to be done in that context. I don't know who would like to take that question. If there is a volunteer, or
I can just buy an example if you want. Actually, one of the things I think that you mentioned, which is clear, is is that skills need, and that's something that was addressed in the beginning, you know. And when we look about, but not only the youth, but even when we were mentioning the teachers and the professors and that digital transformation that higher education has faced over the last 2 years, and the way to cope with it. So we're looking into not only new audiences, because probably now you go through higher education from 18 to 99 years old, and you go into a lifelong learning process or a long life learning process, but also the formats. And in that sense, the formats, it's probably thinking about things like competency certifications or like micro-credentials can actually be some ways that people get skills that they also need their maths, their science, and everything that you mentioned before in order to access the job market, because those skills were, those learnings will be needed. But those skills that make them adaptive, make them resilient, make them innovators, make them conscious to sustainability, make them like, and in that sense, I can say, like, for example, we had a fantastic outcome during the pandemic. Right in the month of March 2020, right in the lockdown, we received a call from, well, Santander Bank, you know, that is huge investor into education. And one of the things they wanted to do is like, hey, we have professors all around the world right now facing and having to teach or having to research remotely and connecting the thing. And actually our institution has been good into blended learning for many years and everything. So say, what could we do? And we set up in a month, everyone locked down, a program for best practice in digital education for teachers and learners. We had more than 10,000 professors all around the world from 54 nationalities connecting and getting into those small micro scholarship for micro credentials in order to have a fast learning process into things. So what I mean in that, I think we need really a mix into those models and the changes between staying with formal formats in which, well, probably we still have undergrad, we still have masters, we still have PhDs for a certain level, but we need also to have other formats that enable people to skill, not only to reskill like it has been taught in the last years, but also to skills along the way in order to be able to be performant or change makers and whatever they want.
Yeah, thank you, Geoffroy. That echoes what Albert, what you were saying, that we need to revisit the offering, so that this 4 years before joining the market is too long, and so this micro credential may be more adapted. Is there also something here that that you would like to add on this particular topic?
Thank you, Gael. And I would actually pick some of the questions that I saw in the chat. The first thing, actually, everything is linked to the cost itself, the cost of running a higher education of a university. You know, when you look at most of the traditional universities, and I'm talking about Africa in particular, university is still expensive, even though some people might argue that ignorance is more expensive. But universities are really very expensive, and yet, when you check the salaries of the teaching staff, they are not competitive. When you look at the existing equipment, they are not really adequate. So there's something wrong somewhere. There's really something wrong that we need to fix. And one of the things that I believe will be important is to make sure people understand we cannot make higher education free. There's no way we can do that. You cannot claim it's free at the same time, you need quality, you need relevance. There's no way we can do that. But I believe in a model that is more shared among the key stakeholders. Of course, government will still be needed, particularly as far as public higher educations are concerned. But we also need to consider, and this is where the modular system I was proposing is very important, how the learners also contribute. So, for example, in some countries, they've initiated what is known as a student loan scheme. When the student, instead of getting a bursary, they get a loan to make them more accountable, that will actually be able to pay once they graduate and they get a job. To me, we are making them more responsible. Number two, it is equally important to make sure that we incentivize, the teaching staff. I saw a question asking about the role that the diaspora could play in this regard. The diaspora needs actually to be incentivized. They need to see there's a value in putting or investing or actually in engaging with higher education, because we have a number of them across the world that are well qualified, but they don't see any incentive to come and be part of the university, be part of the development that you're talking about. In addition, I think we need to look at university as a social enterprise. You know, when you look at most of universities, they are run like departments, as a public good, public institutions without a level of accountability that can allow them to become more competitive. And that's really also equally important. The reason I'm saying we need to see university as an enterprise is because they need to feel they have a business to offer, which is actually basically knowledge and the skills. And by selling that knowledge and skills, they can make money. There's no reason why university should not make money. The question is, how do they reinvest that money so that they can improve the quality and make the university more competitive? So in nutshell, when I'm looking at it, the first redesign to me of universities start from making university enterprise as opposed to public, just public good, where the money they get come as a donation. And as Remy was suggesting, that whoever is going to put money into universities, that money is seen as an investment that will need return in one way or another. It's so important that we need to acknowledge. And make sure now that when companies are attracted to invest, they are actually seeing the potential of return. The return may probably be in the form of getting qualified students that can support companies to grow. The return could be a research, an applied research that is conducted by university that can support the development of a company. So that's the kind of relationship that we need to establish. And I believe that's where the sustainability lies. Thank you.
Does anyone want to react on Alberto saying? And by the way, if you, yeah, exactly, please, Remy, use the hands to make sure that, Remy, you have the floor.
Maybe I may differ a little bit. I think we have to distinguish, of course, vocational training and what is needed for the private sector. But as you know, in many countries in the world, it deals mostly with secondary school more than higher education. If you want to provide the technicians, I mean, what is needed on the market, and certainly the bulk of it, of financing, has to go, and this is the reason why it has to go to primary and secondary school. And the connections here with the private sector have certainly to be strengthened. Which does not mean that of course, they are not valid at university level, but we certainly also need, even in vulnerable, fragile countries, to have a higher education capacity and research capacity. Maybe it will be smaller, maybe it will be, but as a way to inspire, to mobilize, to connect with the rest of the world. And I don't think an educational system missing a higher education component can work efficiently. So good news is that probably it's way less expensive than the rest. But the point is, how could we preserve and allocate part of the concessional resources for this capacity, or convince other financiers to come, and I don't know, for instance, we have this discussion right now in Europe to have what we call a Team Europe initiative to expand the Erasmus program towards Africa and have people move from one region to another. So it's not directly linked to job creation, but I think it's a very crucial component to irrigate both regions in their capacity. Another example, we all know, we are all writing that I mean, traditional knowledge is probably of the utmost importance in the world of SDGs, where we know we have to change our way of producing, consuming, living. So we need a capacity where these knowledge are still alive to study them and share them with the rest of the world. Probably it's far from the market, but it's of a common interest.
Thank you very much. Connected with your previous point of the important needs of better teaching, better teacher training and how to increase that capacity. Also some link with Stavros' question about why innovative financial mechanisms are not taken up that much. Stavros, you want to comment, and then Lise.
Yeah, no, I think there's a certain elegance to Albert's argument around creating a more sort of market-oriented approach to higher education. But I would argue that isn't going to happen while you have this massive mismatch between supply and demand, whereby demand outstrips supply, which is the point that we had made earlier. But also importantly, in many environments, that we have today, higher education institutions aren't penalized for failing. And again, if you're going to have a market system driving change in higher education, you must allow for the possibility of failure. And so I think, absent these two, a situation where you have, you're supply constrained and incumbents, are effectively protected from failure, it's very difficult to see how you have the discipline of the market operating. Unless you, and one way of sort of creating those incentives is to think in terms of paying for outcomes rather than paying for inputs. That's really my intervention. And then one to your point, Gael, when you reflected on what do young people want, and they want education to make them better people, and they want all all the sort of bells and whistles. I think, of course, I mean it's higher education in general really ought to address the totality of what it means to be a human being, and not just sort of the employment needs. But I think there's a danger that we overload too many expectations on higher education, and I think when it comes to funding, and when it comes to what are the pressing needs that we have, that society has, maybe there's there are more cost-effective ways of becoming better people than than a 4-year college degree, or a or a 5-year degree. That there could be better ways to get at this than than this sort of very expensive journey that young people undertake in growing numbers.
With the current model, that's yeah, I would tend to agree with you. Lise, you wanted to have the floor. Do you still want to ask your questions, please?
Yeah, I do. Hello, young person here. And I first of all was really taken aback that a conversation was happening in such a progressive space where people are advocating for having to pay. It seems a little bit punitive. And then I took a step back and I realized that no solution in the world is ever one size fits all. I think that we need to come up with solutions that are adapted to kind of different places and different spaces in time, depending on where we are. But as someone who, I grew up in the United States, where education isn't free. It's not free for all, but luckily I also grew up in California, which is a place that tries to make access to education a little bit more equitable than different places in the United States. So what happened is that I didn't pursue education for a really long time because economically it wasn't feasible. Economically, I was the daughter of Mexican migrants who were trying to make life better for us, and in a way kind of encouraging us to also chase a paycheck and security instead of betterment for society. And unfortunately, I feel like it really held me back. And I feel like there could have been so much more that I could have done in my earlier youth that I am now engaging with now. And so I think that it's a dangerous conversation to think that market-driven solutions are the only solutions. If we've learned anything from kind of these theories that we implement as, you know, economic imperatives, if we've learned anything from the Chicago School of Boys and kind of their functioning in Chile, is that, you know, market-driven solutions are not always the solution. We can incorporate them, they can inform what we're doing, but that can't be the sole thing. We can't turn a conversation that tries to say, how can we make education equitable and accessible to all? And then turn that into kind of a punitive thing where it's just kind of like, well, students need to invest in their own future and you are kind of investing in this. Because as someone already mentioned, it does run the risk of creating larger gaps in equity and exacerbating kind of these social and economic inequities that we are already kind of observing in the world. So I guess that's just my piece on the matter. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, even with this conversation happening now in France, where they're talking about, well, should people have to pay for higher education? And I think that the answer is always no. Where there is the availability to fund education as a public good, even if it's higher education, we should be doing that. We should be providing people with options, not trying to push them into corners simply because they don't have the socioeconomic standing to engage with something larger than themselves. I think if it hadn't, if it hadn't have been for the fact that UC Berkeley is a public university, I would have never been able to complete my higher education. If it wasn't for France that is providing master's degrees at much lower rates than the United States, I would have never had an opportunity to pursue graduate education. And I think that that's super valuable, and it would be really sad because I think like I have a lot of potential that shouldn't be wasted. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz. I think that's somehow summarized the different positions, because Stavros was saying in his opening remarks that private funds might be the most efficient and needs to be tapped into, but at the same time, it might exacerbate inequalities. That's exactly the point that you were raising. And Albert was saying that there will be no potential for higher education if we don't have a way to pay for it. So again, this difference between what needs to be done and who pays for it, and what are the innovative mechanisms for that. We're getting to the end of the session, and I think it only sounds like a warm up where we already have only the ingredients for preparing a good soup. So my only first I would like to thank all of you for being here, especially on such a short notice, because it was a really short notice for putting that session together. But I think it's a very good and promising start, and it's an important conversation. So Minou, I think, I mean, I talk for the two of you. We would love to continue that conversation and unfold these different lines, because we see how complex the issue is, and there's a lot of things to unpack. So there's a lot of people that would like to join that conversation, and so we'll come back to you if you're interested to continue that conversation in the coming months. Thank you very much for being part of that panel. Minou, over to you if you want to have the closing remark.
I just wanted to say thank you. You were all so thought-provoking, and Liz, thank you for your insights and your questions as well. I wish we had more time, but we are grateful for your time today. We will make sure that the recording of the session gets into the hands of many, many others who wanted to be part of the conversation, couldn't be here. So we hope that this is one of the many conversations we will have on this very, very important topic. But with gratitude to all of our panelists, have a wonderful rest of your day, and everybody be safe.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Bye.